The interactive movie, as the genre has come to be known, can be somewhat difficult to define. On paper there's little to differentiate it from the more traditional adventure game, with both featuring a steadfast adherence to plot over gameplay, usually accompanied by more than a small dose of puzzle solving. Some would argue that the distinction lies in the presentation, with titles that emphasize photorealistic graphics, typically with fully digitized actors, and the use of cinematographic camera angles being the key factor, while others would instead point to the typically non-linear stories. Regardless of which argument holds more sway, few can deny the role Quantic Dream has played in the genre's development, blazing a path that games like Until Dawn have eagerly followed. While interactive movies have existed in some form or another for at least 30 years, the French developer first entered the fray in 2005 with Fahrenheit, known as Indigo Prophecy in North America. It was at the time considered somewhat revolutionary for the adventure genre, as it was still considered back then utterly eschewing the typical point-and-click control schemes of the past in favor of a minimalist approach that emphasized replicating on-screen actions as closely as possible, often through the use of quick-time events, in tandem with the game's camera, which while far from perfect was generally competent at creating dramatic scenes. It was clear that Quantic Dream aimed to create a title that was a much cinema as game, and by and large they succeeded. The true beauty of Fahrenheit though lay in its narrative, which charted the course of two characters through an occult murder mystery. While the plot had its share of holes and stretches of the imagination, it nevertheless remained both fascinating and compelling, and was given extra punch by the fact that it was, at that point, one of the most realized attempts at creating branching stories that the industry had seen. It was a success story that only grew with the release of Heavy Rain 5 years later. Following the blueprint that Fahrenheit laid down, Quantic Dream expanded and polished almost every facet, producing a game that many felt was one of the best to ever grace the PlayStation 3. Another murder mystery, this time centered around a group of characters frantically searching for a child abducted by a serial killer. Heavy Rain had one of the most memorable plots ever committed to disc, with more than few harrowing scenes that stuck long after the game had finished. Featuring 23 possible endings, it was also one of the most ambitious games of its generation, and had a sincere dedication to ensuring that players were as immersed as possible. Again through its use of mechanics such as its unconventional controls and camera work. While it did not receive universal acclaim, with the main criticism being leveled against its reliance on the ever unpopular QTE and stop-start pace, it unquestioningly propelled the nascent interactive movie genre into the spotlight, with more than a few games having been clearly inspired by it since. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for Quantic Dream's next attempt, Beyond Two Souls. Hypothetically, this should have been a sure repeat of Heavy Rain's success, with stunning visuals, simplified controls and a cinematic approach backed by two big-name actors. Indeed, in many aspects the game triumphed over its predecessors, especially on a technical level, with superb acting by Ellen Page as the main character Jodie driving home some memorable scenes, backed by an amazing display of motion capture technology which brought both her and Willem Dafoe to life. Where it fell apart though was in its delivery. Featuring a metaphysical sci-fi story that harked back somewhat to Fahrenheit, Quantic Dream chose to present the plot as a disjointed narrative, where gamers would play specific periods of Jodie's life out of chronological order. With a mix of government conspiracies, teen romance, spy thriller and coming-of-age themes, many felt that the plot as a whole was chaotic and unfocused, with little time to develop pivotal characters and events. On its own it would have been fine, but when compared to the studio's previous titles many felt it fell short of the mark. In this context, Detroit Become Human can perhaps be viewed as something of a second attempt. Originating from a tech demo the studio originally released in 2012, Detroit will be set in the eponymous city at a time in which androids have become commonplace servants to humanity, and appear to be on the verge of sentience. The game will be played through the eyes of 3 protagonists, with Kara being a household model, Connor serving as police unit, and Marcus a so-called deviant with aims to liberate androids and give them consciousness. As always with this genre, it is impossible to elaborate further on plot, especially since, according to studio founder David Cage, the number of possible permutations and paths that the story can take far exceed that of previous attempts. What can be stated with certainty, though, is that Detroit is looking to tackle some serious real-world problems of our time, especially with regards to racism, terrorism and class struggles, which will hopefully provide for a more grounded narrative than Beyond Two Souls offered if treated with the respect they deserve. As far as technical aspects are concerned, there shouldn't be many surprises awaiting those who have played a Quantic Dream game before. Built using an entirely new engine, aesthetically the gameplay videos certainly show a sumptuous display, with the likenesses of Jesse Williams, Valerie Curry and Brian Deckard, playing Marcus, Kara and Connor respectively, caught in stunning fidelity. There do appear to be some concessions to gaming standards, however, with Cage stating that the camera can be operable by players if they chose to do so, but will revert to more cinematic angles if left to its own devices. Likewise, he has also said that the game will make less use of QTEs than before, though given the studio's predilections, players can still expect this mechanic to be a prominent feature. Detroit has not been without controversy, however, for all the praise and excitement it has generated over the last 2 years. Specifically, one of the gameplay trailers, which details a potential moment for Kara to gain free will, features a father physically abusing his daughter, and players will have the option to disobey their programming and become a deviant in a desperate attempt to save the girl's life. There has been a fair amount of backlash over the scene, with many claiming that the domestic abuse is gratuitous and unnecessary, though Cage has defended it, stating that he never wrote a violent scene for its own sake, nor was it an attempt at emotional manipulation. Regardless, it certainly stands to highlight Quantic Dream's unflinching resolve to explore some very dark corners of human society. And if the rest of the game follows suit, players can expect more than a few distressing moments. Ultimately, at the core of any game that wants to offer players choice lies an inherent deception, a masking of the fact that developers can only offer a finite number of possible paths. We have seen some truly genius efforts over the last few years, though many that have strived for this goal have failed, mainly due to players being offered too little impact on the final outcome or artificial restrictions being too obvious. Quantic Dream have had plenty of practice in this department though, and more than ever it seems that Detroit Become Human is looking to provide gamers with a truly magnificent illusion. David Cage's android thriller just can't shy away from controversy. Kara, bought by drug-addled Todd to act as housekeeper and nanny after his wife left him, is programmed to follow orders. We don't see many players doing so here. The star of the Paris Games Week demo, Kara, predates the game by some years. She was the focus of a tech demo shown by Quantic Dream at GDC in 2012, when the studio sought to show off what it had planned for their next-gen platforms. Well, she looks even better now, perfect and gleaming in Todd's tumble-down flea pit of a home. The advantage Cage's tightly directed games have always had is their ability to devote all available processing power to a strictly controlled space. Here, that means 4K, HDR and a welcome, if largely unnecessary, 60 FPS. Quantic Dream is an easy target for many reasons, but there's no querying its technical chops. After a run-in with Todd, Kara seeps blue blood, her face bruised white. She heals up in seconds, though. Todd is the real problem in this latest demo, but perhaps not for the reasons Cage and team intended. He's a caricature. There's no faulting the game's aesthetic, a winning sci-fi blend of gleaming neon towers and, beneath the surface, ramshackle poverty. Alice bears the brunt of Todd's wrath. He blames her, not his drug habit, for his wife leaving. Not to be harsh, but surely you'd take the kid too. Kara's choices during the climactic action scene are standard fight or flight fare, though as in all Cage's games you have to work pretty hard to mess up. Connor's ability to analyze every interactive object does throw up some delightful incidental details, some of which even prompt conversation options. He can, for example, even warn Hank about the calorific value of the donuts on his desk. Even if Marcus dies, the android rebellion continues, via non-interactive cutscenes. Having chosen to peacefully protest as Marcus, we were a little perturbed that the new rebel leader opted for a gung-ho approach that undid all our good work. There are two difficulty settings available from the outset, one of which makes the QTE action sequences simpler and ensures you're less likely to lose a character. This is some of the finest performance capture we've seen to date, and if there's a slight uncanniness to it, then it certainly fits the android characters. The quality of the performances helps that too. Of course, Marcus's story peaks early, as he effectively comes back from the dead. It's one of Detroit's most striking sequences, establishing his indomitable spirit, and yet as a leader he's an oddly uncharismatic figure. You're frequently made aware of the fluctuations in public opinion about androids, which shifts as a direct result of your actions. Oddly, it seems you can negatively affect this by simply turning on the TV and witnessing a news item as if the act itself wouldn't have mattered had we not seen it reported, though it's Marcus, whose activities have a more tangible, lasting impact. As the android uprising ferments, you can choose to adopt a more violent or pacifist approach. Regardless, the media reports your activities as terrorist attacks. As such, it's jarring when public opinion is shown to be positive, particularly since almost every other line of incidental NPC dialogue suggests a pervasive prejudice against the machines. To be abundantly clear, David Cage can make a game about whatever on earth he wants. Yet bravery is no shield from critique, and daring no guarantor of quality. The fuss around the latest showing of Detroit Become Human was not born of its subject matter, a demo in which a drug-addled father beats his terrified young daughter. Though whichever marketing bod deemed it at all appropriate for a livestream that went out shortly after the end of the school day may have a few regrets. Detroit's is not a problem of tone. Rather, it is one of execution. To put it bluntly, it was just bad. The father, Todd, sits on a sofa, huffing at a pipe, scratching madly at his arms, muttering darkly about his lot. Moments later, over dinner, just the thing after a whopping dose of amphetamine, he carries on with his miserablest shtick, complaining about the wife who left him because of his drug use. He leans towards Alice, his daughter. "Not the life you dreamed of, eh?" he slurs, his delivery wooden in the extreme, his accent impossible to place. It is at this point, shortly before he upends the dinner table and gives Alice a crushing backhander, that we realize this fellow looks familiar. Soon after, unbuckling his belt, he delivers the killing blow. "Alice," he calls up the stairs, "Daddy's very mad." Suddenly, it hits us. Todd is a dead ringer for Tommy Wiseau, writer, director and star of The Room, by common consensus the worst film ever made. Draw your own conclusions from that. So yes, look, it's not very good, possibly worse. It fails to provide or explore the notional USP of David Cage's work. What difficult decision does this pose to the player? Todd heads upstairs, telling Kara, the family android, not to move. As Kara, we're given a choice: do we obey the order and stand still? Or do we disobey, head upstairs and stop him? We are not exactly torn. It would take one heck of a committed roleplayer to stand there and listen while a strung-out mess of a father goes to town on his 5-year-old daughter. Upstairs waits Cage's stock-in-trade sequence of a woman fighting off a dangerous man, all desperate stick flicks and awkward combinations of button presses, before Kara and Alice somehow escape. Todd might be screaming at you from an upstairs window, or lying on the floor with a bullet in his chest, and ride to safety on a bus that arrives at the perfect time. Fade to black, and roll controversy. It's hard to understand exactly what purpose it all serves. Yes, Cage is entitled to explore difficult themes, but only if those themes serve a higher purpose in the game's story or design. This does neither, and it's an odd fit for a game whose creator spent most of E3 insisting that the obvious racial connotations of his tale of an android underclass rising up were simply a coincidence. You cannot have it both ways. Which is a shame, because another sit-down with the sequence first shown on Sony's E3 stage in 2016 where Connor, an android negotiator, talks a hostage-taking deviant down from a literal ledge, is engaging stuff. While it's tempting to roll the eyes at Sony trotting out an old demo again, it's a smart fit for the game, an opportunity to see what happens when different choices are made. We do our research indoors, each discovery raising our percentage chance of completion. But once we step outside, where an android has gone rogue and has a gun pointed to a young girl's head, we decide to play it differently to see just how wrongly things can go. We play it heartless, senseless and dumb. At E3, we'd raised our probability of success to 100%, the girl saved, the deviant android pumped full of SWAT team lead. Here, we push it down to 13%. We save the girl, but only by killing Connor, sending him tumbling off the rooftop. In the context of the day, it's fitting, a series of ill-advised decisions leading, inevitably, to self-sabotage. Perhaps Cage, and Sony's marketing team, could do with heeding the game's own advice. A common complaint about any game with a branching narrative is that the decisions you as a player invariably mean little in the grand scheme of things. That all choices eventually converge at the same point. To which most storytellers would respond by insisting that it's about the journey, not the destination. Detroit Become Human, however, offers a pointed rejoinder to accusations of smoke and mirrors whenever you pause the game. Here, you'll find an extensive flowchart, highlighting a remarkably divergent array of possible routes, spidering out from the point of narrative entry. Some of these admittedly, end up in the same place, but certain key choices carry over to future chapters, shaping character relationships, opening up crucial dialogue options or even introducing potential ways out of dangerous situations. There are, to Quantic Dream's credit, plenty of avenues to explore, and endings to see. Whether you'll want to, however, is another matter. Detroit's narrative triptych begins in 2038, the two intervening decades having witnessed the rise of androids and their uneasy integration into society, with manufacturer Cyberlife having become the planet's most powerful corporation. In a dramatic opening scene, we're introduced to Connor, an advanced model of android tasked with tracking down rogue machines or deviants, in the game's parlance. Later, control passes to Kara, live-in nanny to a young, quiet girl and her angry, drug-abusing father. And between the two there's Marcus, carer for an aging painter, who treats his robot assistant with rather more affection than the game's other human characters. The notion of machines as an oppressed minority has been explored in sci-fi many times before, albeit often as subtext. Here, however, it is aggressively foregrounded. As a writer, David Cage has never exactly been a model of subtlety, but here he wields allegory with a similar grace and lightness of touch to which Leatherface uses power tools. In Detroit's second chapter, Marcus, significantly, a non-white android is pushed to the ground and kicked as he collects a set of paints from a local store. Shortly after, an extended shot of him standing alongside his kind within a segregated compartment at the back of a bus. The chapter title, just in case you hadn't quite grasped the point Cage is trying to make, is Shades of Color. Warming to his theme, Cage continues to wade in with both feet as Marcus learns to fight back, such that we began to wonder if he didn't consider an alternative title. David Cage's Android Lives Matter. An attempt at a rousing civil rights march is clumsily staged, a literal wave of the hand glosses over a major plot contrivance while one look away now moment directly invokes Martin Luther King, repurposing the activist's most famous mantra as a graffiti slogan. Far be it for us to suggest that a developer shouldn't approach provocative subject matter, but on this evidence perhaps Quantic Dream isn't quite the studio to do it justice. The two other stories fare rather better, though Kara's escape from an abusive owner, demoed at last year's Paris Games Week, has already provoked its own line of angry op-eds. Still, once she's away she proves the most sympathetic of the central trio, developing something akin to a mother's love for her young charge, Alice. An early episode which charges her with finding a place to stay the night is charged with a prickly tension. A motel looks the most inviting option, but she'll need to find money first. An abandoned house is far less appealing to Alice, yet unlikely to attract unwanted attention. They'll need a change of clothes, too, but the child is sure to take a dim view of stealing from a sleeping laundromat customer, in all probability weakening their bond. It's during these moments, where you're presented with several choices, each representing some kind of compromise, that Detroit really hits its stride. Likewise, whenever a nearby threat forces you to think on your feet, one scene that requires you to hide evidence without arousing the suspicion of a prowling police officer is a bona fide nail-biter. The third strand is a more conventional detective story, enlivened by the augmented abilities of its lead. During a rooftop chase, for example, Connor can scan his environment for potential routes, allowing you to choose between fast but risky and slow but safe on the fly. An investigation set in an android sex club invites him to hack into each pleasure bot's recent visual memories, allowing him to track the movement of a suspect before the trace goes cold. For reasons that aren't convincingly explained, Connor teams up with Hank, a man who has anti-android slogans on his desktop, who frequently expresses his distaste at having an android partner, and whose entire character arc can be guessed with reasonable accuracy within seconds of meeting him drowning his sorrows at a bar. Still, their odd couple dynamic does at least introduce a few notes of dry humor in an otherwise doggedly bleak story. Connor's investigatory role chimes best with the narrative's structure, too, at least in the sense that you're more overtly rewarded for thoroughness. While analyzing crime scenes, he can taste blue blood, to divine an android's model, and recreate the sequence of events leading up to a murder from the evidence he finds. Either from this, or simply by studying the local environment carefully, finding more clues and details opens up fresh lines of inquiry. Whether a discovery leads you to locating a suspect in the same chapter, or unlocks a critical conversation path later on. You're alerted whenever this happens, with the UI displaying a padlock sliding open. As an early tutorial makes clear, this is usually beneficial. Yet from a story perspective it's a double-edged sword, serving to clearly foreshadow later events. It might help if Cage wasn't such a firm believer in Chekhov's gun. There are no obvious red herrings here, and thus few real surprises. In fact, the game's main twist, disappointingly, it's one that significantly weakens one of the storylines is so heavily telegraphed it's almost a shock when Cage follows through with it. The controls a regular Quantic Dream sticking point are also bothersome. Cage's fondness for mimicking actions with the right stick means that sometimes you'll try to open a door and only end up shifting the camera across and down because you weren't quite standing in the precise spot. The usual Simon Says action sequences are compromised by choppy editing and an excessively shaky camera that only really allows you to focus on the prompts, ensuring you never really see what's going on. Commands are inconsistent elsewhere, too. Sometimes you'll climb by pushing the right stick up, sometimes by jerking the controller upwards, and for anything involving motion it's touch and go whether you'll get a response. More irritatingly, dialogue options can sometimes present you with a single word or short phrase, without making it clear what that might mean. One ally takes offense when we ask her a question ostensibly about her well-being. During a later sequence, meanwhile, we're given a choice accept or refuse after two characters have spoken, without knowing whose proposal was supposed to be welcoming or turning down. In a game that makes a point of ensuring your actions have lasting consequences, this lack of clarity and consistency is all the more frustrating. For all these irritating shortcomings, and the glaring plot holes besides, there is still much to admire about Detroit. Its setting is superbly realized, establishing a convincingly dystopian vision of a future where high-tech and low-income collide. Clancy Brown as Hank might deliver the standout performance, but the three leads all acquit themselves well. Selling the shift from obedient servant to sentient almost human with the help of some outstanding capture work. There are several individual moments you won't soon forget, besides. A desperate escape from an android graveyard conjures a truly hellish vision of walking half-corpses, with muffled sounds and tinnitus whines, the result of a broken audio receiver, making it more unsettling still. A sequence in an abandoned fairground is a quietly moving triumph of visual storytelling. And the final chapters, where the three paths invariably collide, lay bare the extent to which your choices matter, the long strands of empty, untold story making a replay all the more tempting even as the presence of checkpoints slightly undercuts the permanence of your actions. Yet though the sheer number of variables gives Detroit plenty of conversational cachet outside the game, a valuable facet of interactive storytelling in itself, it feels more like a series of memorable moments, and not always for the right reasons, than a satisfying whole while you're playing. For all the very human flaws in its script, it ends up somewhere in the uncanny valley of narrative games. It looks the part, but behind that glistening exterior, something vital is undeniably missing. Having done the rounds at preview events, Detroit's stormy night sequence has already attracted plenty of critical attention. Its depiction of domestic violence is hardly the first we've seen in a video game. But the disquieting notion that there could be a right way to escape abuse understandably came under close scrutiny. Though the judgment perhaps seemed a little premature given that we didn't have the context of the full story, the finished game hardly ameliorates the issue. Indeed, the unspoken suggestion that each scenario is essentially a puzzle of sorts with several potential solutions is made more explicit by those narrative flowcharts. In fact, the entire sequence summarizes the strengths and weaknesses of Quantic Dream's most ambitious game to date, somehow contriving to be a dramatic peak and one of its most troubling scenes all at once. It is David Cage in excelsis, magnifying not only his sometimes laudable creative ambition but also his most worrying peccadillos. You could intercut Kara's early scenes with shots from Ethan Ma's home in Heavy Rain, and beyond the superior textures and the presence of an android au pair it would be hard to notice the joins. Her arrival back at the home of Todd and his daughter Alice is seen in a previous chapter, where ominous clouds serve as a melodramatic harbinger of bad times. Already we're aware that Todd broke his previous Kara unit in a fit of rage, while Alice's withdrawn personality is revealed as she sits silently in the background as Kara follows Todd's orders to tidy up the place. Rudimentary inputs give us some involvement in tidying up, while we remotely interface with a Roomba-like vacuum cleaner. It's simple stuff, but it works, establishing an uneasy but relatively benign atmosphere, at least until Kara finds a baggie of drugs. Todd appears almost instantly, gripping her around the throat and threatening her, before we're given the relief of returning to Marcus and Connor's stories ahead of the second pivotal scene where a storm arrives in every sense. One meltdown later, Todd is prowling around, threatening to come upstairs and teach his daughter a lesson. As Kara dutifully awaiting her next orders, Todd warns her not to move, or I'll bust you worse than last time. At which point, a single twitch of the analog stick is enough for the android to commit to deviancy. There's a close-up of Kara's face, her eyes wide in shock at the revelation that she may not have to obey, though first she must break through the barrier of her programming. It's represented as a tangible obstruction, a wireframe wall that requires some physical exertion on the player's part to smash through. Then she stares at her hands, seemingly awestruck. It may echo an earlier scene involving Marcus, but the sense of injustice, and the presence of an imminent threat makes this moment a scalp-prickling delight. The desires of player and protagonist in total alignment. Then comes the not insignificant matter of achieving your objective, protect Alice. Consult the flowchart, and you'll note that almost every other choice seems to splinter into 2, then 4, then 8. Several of these end up at similar points, but there are over 60 boxes on Stormy Night's flowchart, and you'll miss most of them on a single playthrough. If you reach Alice before Todd, you can lock her door and escape through the window as he breaks in. If you found a gun in the previous chapter, you can threaten him with it. You can attempt to reason with Todd, bad idea, or hide in another room before bolting for the front door or the garden. The game has already established the stakes, and so the entire sequence is charged with a tension you don't often find in games where failure simply means restarting from the last checkpoint. It is, in many respects, an effectively nasty piece of drama, dark, intense and truly nerve-wracking. And one optional branch prompts one of the game's best exchanges. Brandishing a tall lamp, Kara stands in front of Alice, breathing heavily. "I won't let you hurt her," she says with a surge of newfound defiance. "You won't let me," sneers Todd, his tone at once mocking yet faintly incredulous. It's one of few moments where Cage's script says just enough, a rare exception in a game that prefers to overtell rather than show. Todd's constant muttering to himself can be attributed to his drug use, but it regularly seems as though it's exposition he's been snorting. As if Todd's reminder to Kara of prior abuse, a fact we learn in the first scene, wasn't enough, Alice warns her to run, or he's going to break you like last time. Then again, perhaps that's preferable to the alternative. Having connected with Alice in an earlier scene, we unlock her music box to find 3 sequential crayon drawings depicting Todd smashing Kara to pieces. One of the most unintentionally funny attempts at environmental storytelling we've ever seen. More worrying is that Todd is the latest in an increasing line of Cage's grubby, angry men who like to abuse young, attractive women and/or children, and even if you kill him. There's an ill-advised survival horror episode to come involving another. Villains and the violence they perpetrate, and how we as players experience that violence is something with which the medium's storytellers will have to wrestle in future. For now, Cage and Quantic Dream will surely have some uncomfortable questions to consider.